Okay, part 2 of object properties and what they're all about. In the last video I covered the outlines in the Creator level, which are also in Designer Plus level, of single, triple, sculptured run, backstitch, stem stitch, zigzag and satin. I just want to go back a little bit in this video before I move on to the raised satin and blanket stitch, and then the Designer Plus outlines, which are only available in Designer Plus. So in the zigzag stitch, we saw we could change the width here by a numeric value. There is another way to change the width on the fly, so you don't need to open the object properties to do that. I've just got it open to show you that the width here will change. But if you select your object, I'll just click off. Can I? No, I can't, because I've got the object properties open. Let's just close that for the moment. Okay, so if I click on just select, so I've selected the object, and then I go to the reshape tool, I'll get my nodes, and here's the line I digitized. I left clicked here and left clicked there, and that created those two square nodes which define the line of the zigzag. Now if you look closely, I'll just zoom in here, there are also two tiny little brown nodes at the top and bottom where the start of the line is, and if you hover over those you'll get the move tool, and you can actually change the width here, and there'll be a little box next to your cursor telling you the width that you've made it. So the original width was 1.46 if I'm about right, 1.5 probably, there we go, and as I stretch it out it's increasing. So I've now got a 2.99. It's hard to get exactly on the right amount here, but it can be useful if you want to change the width and you just release and it changes. It can be useful to change the width in a design if you want to get it in relation to other objects in the design. So you want to fill in an area or make something a little bit larger so that it looks in balance with the rest of the design. So that's when it's useful to move this, and it doesn't have to be on an exact amount. If I go back to select and go back to the object properties, that will now show the new width here of 4.17, and you can fine tune that there if you want afterwards. So I could make that 4 for instance and apply if I think I've just gone a little bit overboard. But as I said, you have that option there. I'll just go OK. Now while that's selected, I'm going to change that to satin stitch. And the same applies when you go to the reshape tool in satin stitch. Where the start is, you'll find those two little brown handles where you can change the width manually to balance with the rest of your design. So it doesn't have to be done in the object properties, but again you can select and open your object properties, and there you will have your width here where you can change it manually to a specific amount, for instance 4, and apply that. Okay, let's move on now to raised satin. So what I'm going to do, rather than digitize another object, I'm just going to, while this is selected, I'm going to click on the raised satin outline, because you can change your outlines just by selecting them and clicking on any of the other outline tools. You don't have to re-digitize the line. So when I did that, the object properties immediately changed to the raised satin as well. So if you've only used the apply, the box will stay open, and whatever you do here will be reflected in the object properties box here. So it's got automatic spacing. If you want to change the spacing, you'll have to select manual, and then you can change the spacing, just as the same in satin. The width is shown here, and the center and offset, they're exactly the same as satin, but the additional option you've got here is how many layers. So let me just go out of true view and zoom in And I'll take the underlay out just so that you can not be confused. Oh, it didn't have an underlay. I'm not sure why it didn't have an underlay. By default it usually does, but okay, so you might be able to see here that I've got layers of stitching even without an underlay. With raised satin, what it does is it does a narrow layer first, then a slightly wider layer, then a wider layer again, and then the final layer. It works through like that. Now, it says here 3 layers. I'm just going to zoom out and we'll watch this stitch. So I'll put it back into True View and run the stitch player. Didn't have to have it in True View. But here you can see the first layer and then the second layer stitching. That makes more sense than trying to see it through. And then the third layer stitching, and then actually a 4th layer. So even though it says 3 layers, and I'm not sure why that's gone back to back stitch, but let's just select the object again. And yes, it's gone back to raised satin, so it must have gone back when I deselected it to whatever I was looking at previously. But so you get the general idea. So even though it says 3 layers, it's 3 layers underneath the top layer. Now you can increase that to 4, 5. 5 is the maximum, and you can go down, of course, to 2, which will give you actually 3 layers of stitching, or 1, which just gives you an slight extra raised effect. So you can experiment with that. I actually have used raised satin as stems in flowers on firm woven fabric that I wanted to use as a bag, for instance, just to give a bit of dimension to the embroidery. So it can be quite useful for that sort of thing. It actually really lifts. If you go up to 5, you'll get a really raised bar of stitching. Of course, it does use a lot of thread, but it's the effect you want. Okay, and again, if I select that and go to the reshape tool, I can change the width here. You wouldn't want to go too narrow if you've got lots of layers, because you're going to really be stitching almost into the same needle point. Let's go out of True View and zoom in. Oh, and your first layer will be a very tiny zigzag as well. If I put the grid on, that's the grid. So that's 1 centimetre across. So this tiny little first layer, let's view measure it. You measure this tiny layer, the width of that is only 0.47, so don't get too carried away with very narrow raised satin, because you are getting narrower layers underneath and they get increasingly more difficult to stitch. Right, I'll just escape out of the measure tool and go back to True View and zoom out again, and I'll just bring that across. So, whoa, it'd be too far. I'll just use the arrows so I don't get too carried away. There we go. Zoom out a little bit more and I'll select it and move it to where I want it. That would be the more sensible idea. Okay, so the next stitch in the creator level is the blanket stitch. So I'm going to change this to a blanket stitch, and I will turn off the grid again so it's not interfering. Now I've just got a very short stitch here, so I'm going to zoom out, I'm going to reshape it, and I'm going to make it longer so we get a few more blanket stitches. Okay, I'm not sure why I'm not getting a tooth at this end, but I'm not, no matter how long I make it. All right. Okay, so blanket stitch has quite a few options in the object properties, but it also has this width option here to change the length of the teeth. I'm going to undo that. So that's the blanket width, it's called here. 2.7 is the default maybe, and then you can increase that. You wouldn't want to go too long though, because you're going to get very long stitches here. Stitch spacing is the distance between each tooth. So if I hover over there, you can see on the right hand side of the object properties the arrow indicating what that is measuring. So at this stage it's 4. I can make that less, say 3, and my teeth will come closer together. I can change the width to smaller than the default as well. So you'll see the little blue arrow here on the right indicating when you hover over the amount, what it's measuring. Now, we've got orientation. So when I digitized, the standard was for the teeth to face down, so left to right. Let me just zoom out and create another one. So I'll select and click off and get my open object, and I'll create a vertical one this time. So I'm going to choose blanket stitch, and I'm just going to left click there and left click there and enter. And you'll notice the teeth face to the left. Now if I had left clicked here at the bottom and then at the top and entered, they'll face to the right. So the orientation is based on your first click sort of thing. And same with your orientation here. If I click on the right and go to the left, enter, my teeth will face upwards. So the direction you digitize will determine the direction the teeth will be created. So if I had an arc, or let's do, so an open object, so I'm going to right click, right click, right click, and I'm going right to left. I'm going anti-clockwise if I was going round a clock, and enter, and my teeth will all face out. But if I go the other way, go clockwise, and enter, my teeth will face inwards. So you can remember that. But if you get it wrong and you don't want to redigitize the line, moving the start and end points won't fix it. So what you can do is select the object that you want to change. Let's say this last one that I digitized here, this center one here, and I can invert the direction and apply that, and so now my teeth are facing outwards. So don't panic if you digitize in the wrong direction. You can inverse it through the object properties. Now let's zoom in on this one here and select it, and we can actually look at it in the reshape tool, and we can see that the digitizing line, if I zoom right in, the yellow dot where I digitized is here. That's the first digitizing point. I left clicked, and then at the other end I have got another node where I left clicked as well. So I'm not sure why that end is there. That should be here. Okay, I was fiddling around a bit before I did this section. Okay, so it might have been when I started digitizing other things so that the closest join applied. Right, let's just zoom out and zoom in again if I can. I'll select it and move it to where I want it. Zoom out just a bit, select it and move it. Okay, right. So if we want our digitizing line to be along the top here, so we're digitizing around another object in our design, and we want the blanket stitch to edge on that edge of the object. This also applies to applique. You will obviously want this line here to be on the edge of your applique, but you would do that in the applique tool, but it's the same sort of principle. So while this is selected, I'll actually go back to the reshape tool so you can see there's my node there, and if I click on the offset and apply that, you will see now my digitizing line. You can't see the yellow one because it's under the orange width adjustment, but there is a yellow dot under there too where the object starts, and the digitizing line goes along here, and there's another yellow dot here where it ends. So they're the 2 points of the digitizing line. So it's now on this digitizing line here. This is confusing. This black line here in the reshape tool is actually just indicating the width of the teeth. So don't be confused by that. It's not the digitizing line. Look for the yellow nodes, this larger yellow nodes, and you'll see that the digitizing line is now under this spine of the blanket stitch. Okay, so they are the tools in the blanket stitch, but there is one issue that happens, and I'll just go to my other design to show you that. I think, yes, there it is. Okay, let's get rid of the grid for a moment. If you use the offset tool in a closed object like I did here, the teeth all distort because it doesn't happen with the ellipses, but if you create a manual closed object, I'll do it from scratch so you can see. So I'll just do it without a fill, but that was just to demonstrate that you may want to use the offset with a fill or, as I said, with an applique. So let's do a closed object, and I'll just do it blanket stitch, and I've got the red colour, that will work well. Okay, so I do my blanket stitch like this, and I've got an angled object. It could have a curve in it. Let's just put a curve in here and enter. Alright, so there's my blanket stitch, and you can see the teeth are nicely facing in to the center. Now if I select that object and choose to offset that one and apply, you can see now that my teeth are all on an angle, and that's not as nice to look at. So I did find a way around this. Now if you're just digitizing a shape and you're not doing an applique, this will apply. You can also do it with an applique, but you have to break the applique apart. But I haven't tested this in applique yet, and I will do a separate video on this. But I just wanted to quickly include this in the in this video. So how do we get around it? So I'm going to undo that, and I'm going to just change this to a single run. So what I would do is digitize a single run first. Okay, or in this case I had a fill and I just digitized. So let's just take that fill out as well so I can do it in both. So I'll select that fill and right click and drag a copy of that. So you could have a fill or you could have an outline, really doesn't matter. We'll do it on the outline first. So I know that my blanket stitch, let me just find one here. Actually, I made a mistake earlier. The default width for blanket stitch is 3 millimeters. So I know I need to move it in 1.5 halfway because the digitizing line runs through the middle of the blanket stitch. So what I want to do is create an offset outline for this shape. So I'll select it and I'll go to my edit tab in my toolbox and go to the outlines and offsets tool and deselect object outlines. Make sure you've got a check mark in the offset outlines, and we want to put it at -1.5 because we want to offset this inwards. -1.5, and I'll just change the color so it's different to the other one. So we'll make this the blue, and I chose to use the square corners and go, or the sharp corners, and I'll go OK. And there is my line, exactly 1.5 in from my shape. Now I can select that line, because in the outlines and offsets, if I just go back and go to the outlines and offsets, you don't have, whoops, that's the colors, you don't have an option for blanket stitch. You've got back stitch, raised satin, satin line, sculpture run, single, stem stitch, triple and zigzag. That's why I use the single. There's no blanket stitch in there, in the creator level at least. I'll check in the designer plus shortly. So I'll just cancel that now. I just wanted to show you that. So that's why I use the single run. Now I've got that single run there. I can select that single run. I'll just go to individual objects and select it here in the color film because it's easier. It's underneath here, but it was just easier to select it that way. And I can choose the blanket stitch from here. And my blanket stitch, because it's centered on that line, that blue line, actually went back to the original line where I wanted it, and the teeth are actually much nicer. They're coming in square from the shape. I'll just select that. I'm going to move this object properties to the other side so I can select this one and bring that off as a copy and change that to blanket stitch again. I can click down here and do the offset so you can compare and apply. Right, so now we can compare the two. See how these are angled in, but here they're straight. So if this is the look you want, that's how to do it. And you can, as I said, you can do it with a shape like this. I'll just close that. You can offset. It's still got all my same settings, but I'll change that to red so it's contrasting. Go OK. And then select that and change it to blanket stitch. And you'll get a much nicer look compared to this. Okay, so I think I've covered everything for the creator level in the outline stitches. The next video I do will be the rest of the outline stitches that Designer Plus have. So if you want to, if you've got creator level and you want to see what those are, you can watch that. Otherwise, if you wait patiently, I'll start on the fills in the following video. Don't forget, you can always book a one-on-one consultation with me. I'll put a link below to my Tidy Cow for that. Plus, you can see my designs that I have for sale at Creative Fabrica. I'll put a link below for that. And I hope you enjoy your digitizing.